On the edge of one of America's oldest cities, there is a lake. From a distance, on a clear morning, it looks almost ordinary. The water is calm. The Syracuse skyline sits along the far shore. Gulls drift over the surface. But for most of the last 100 years, the people who lived here learned to look away from this water. They did not swim in it. They were warned never to eat anything that came out of it. Some of them rolled up their car windows when they drove past, because of the smell. This was once called the most polluted lake in the United States. At the bottom of it sat more than 80 tons of mercury and over 7 million cubic yards of poisoned mud. Scientists described it as a place where almost nothing could survive. And then something strange happened. People decided to bring it back. So how does a lake that the world had written off as dead end up decades later with more than 260 species of living things calling it home again? The answer is one of the most remarkable stories in the history of American science, and almost nobody knows it. This is the story of Onondaga Lake. 150 years ago, this same shoreline was one of the most beautiful destinations in the Northeast. In the 1800s, Onondaga Lake was a resort. There were sandy beaches here, grand hotels, and amusement parks strung along the water. Families traveled from all over to swim in the clear lake and to eat the famous local whitefish, pulled fresh that morning. And for the people who had lived here longest, the Onondaga Nation, this water was far older than any resort. It was sacred ground, a place they had protected and honored for more than 1,000 years. The lake teemed with life. Frogs and turtles crowded the shallows. Mink moved along the banks. Eagles circled overhead, and hundreds of fish moved through the water below. That was Onondaga Lake. And in the span of a single human lifetime, it was very nearly destroyed. The trouble began with salt. Beneath the hills around Syracuse lay enormous underground deposits of salt. And in 1884, a company called the Solvay Process Company built a plant on the western shore to turn that salt into soda ash, a chemical used to make glass, paper, and detergent. The business boomed, and Syracuse grew rich on it. But the process created staggering amounts of waste, and the lake became the place to put it. Year after year, decade after decade, the plant sent its byproducts straight into the water. Along the western shoreline, huge pale beds of chemical waste piled up, some of them dozens of feet thick, smothering the ground where marshes used to be. The company changed hands over the generations. It became Allied Chemical, and later part of the corporation known today as Honeywell. But the dumping did not stop. Then there was the mercury. The plant used mercury in its chemical process, and over the years it released an estimated 165,000 pounds of it into the lake. That is not a misprint. More than 80 tons of a heavy metal that attacks the human brain and nervous system poured into the same water where children had once learned to swim. And on top of the industrial poison came the sewage. As the city grew, its waste flowed into the lake as well, feeding thick mats of algae that rotted and pulled the oxygen out of the water. In the worst years, the deep water of the lake went completely without oxygen for months at a time, becoming a lifeless dead zone where nothing but bacteria could endure. The water turned strange colors. It gave off a sour, chemical stench that drifted over the nearby roads. Scientists came from across the country to study it, not for its beauty, but as a warning. A textbook example of just how completely human beings could wreck a body of water. Along the shore, the pale industrial waste beds grew so vast that they became a permanent feature of the landscape, a white scar you could see for miles. And somehow it kept getting worse. By 1940, swimming was banned. By 1970, once the danger of the mercury was finally understood, fishing was banned completely. The warning signs had been there for a long time. A biological survey back in 1928 had already found that where the lake once held dozens of kinds of fish, only about 10 species were still hanging on. For decades, almost no one in a position of power was willing to say plainly what every family living nearby already knew. The lake was dying, and it was being killed. For a long time, that could have been the end of it. A poisoned lake fading quietly behind a growing city. But in the 1980s, the tide began to turn. a local legal foundation took the county to court over the raw sewage still flowing into the lake, arguing that it violated the Clean Water Act. The state of New York joined the case. Slowly, the machinery of a real cleanup began to grind into motion. Then, in 1994, the federal government made it official. Onondaga Lake was declared a Superfund site, placing it among the most hazardous contaminated places in the entire country, and putting the companies responsible on the hook to pay for the repair. But the question of how to fix it opened a far deeper conflict, one that is still unresolved today. Honeywell, the corporation carrying most of the cost, backed a plan to dredge out the worst of the sediment and then seal the rest of the poison beneath a cap on the lake bottom. To a lot of people, that sounded practical. To the Onondaga Nation, it sounded like hiding the problem rather than solving it. Because to them, this lake was never simply a resource. It was an ancestor. According to their history, it was here, on these very shores, that 5 warring nations came together in peace and formed the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, binding themselves under a great law of peace. That system of governance was so admired that some of the founders of the United States studied it while shaping their own ideas about democracy. For the Onondaga people, healing this lake was never about capping a hazard and walking away. It was about restoring a relationship that had lasted more than 1,000 years and had been shattered in a single century. That tension between managing the poison and truly removing it would shadow this cleanup from the first day to the present. By the 2000s, the cleanup was fully underway, and the scale of it was hard to imagine. At the same time, the county rebuilt its aging sewage plant, the single largest source of water flowing into the lake, so that it no longer flooded the water with the nutrients that had been feeding those suffocating blooms of algae. Out on the lake itself, barges and dredging rigs spread across the surface. Over several years, crews pulled more than 2 million cubic yards of contaminated sediment off the lake bed and sealed it away in a secure containment site built to hold it. The dredging alone removed enough poisoned mud to bury a small neighborhood, and remarkably, that phase finished a full year ahead of schedule. They laid a thick cap of clean sand and gravel across hundreds of acres of the bottom. They drove an underground wall deep into the earth along the old industrial land to stop poisoned groundwater from bleeding back into the lake. It became one of the largest environmental cleanups this country had ever attempted. All told, it would take more than 2 decades and over $1 billion, an effort that pulled in hundreds of scientists and engineers, thousands of workers, and millions of hours of labor. Whole careers were spent on this one lake. Children who were born when the cleanup began grew up and finished school before it was finally done. And yet the single most important discovery of the whole project was something you could never have seen from a barge. It was unfolding at a scale far too small for the human eye. For years, nearly everyone assumed the central enemy was the mercury itself. They turned out to be only half right. Here is what the scientists came to understand. Mercury, sitting as a raw metal in the mud, is dangerous, but on its own it does not climb easily into fish or into the animals that eat those fish. The truly frightening form is a compound called methylmercury. And methylmercury is not manufactured in any factory. It is made by living things. Down at the bottom of the lake, in the cold, dark, oxygen-starved mud, live vast populations of tiny bacteria. Certain of these bacteria, as they go about surviving without oxygen, take the raw mercury around them and quietly transform it into methylmercury, the version that rockets up through the food chain. It builds up first in the plankton. The plankton are eaten by small fish. The small fish are eaten by bigger fish. And by the time you reach an eagle or an osprey at the very top, the poison has concentrated many thousands of times over. In other words, the lake was not only holding poison, the lake was making it, day and night, in the mud, using nothing more than bacteria and time. So how do you stop an entire lake bed from producing poison? You cannot scrub microscopic life out of millions of cubic yards of mud. The solution that a team of local scientists arrived at sounds, when you first hear it, completely backward. They decided, in effect, to fertilize the lake. The bacteria that make methylmercury depend on a very particular chemistry, a world with no oxygen, where they breathe sulfur instead. So the team began pumping a solution of calcium nitrate down into the deep water of the lake. The nitrate shifted the chemistry of that deep layer just enough to interrupt the bacteria, to strip away the exact conditions they needed to turn mercury into its deadly form. It sounded absurd, and the team did not simply guess and hope. For 3 years, they ran the whole idea as a careful experiment first, measuring the deep water through every season, watching to see whether the poison would stay locked in the mud where it belonged. It did. Only then did they take the treatment full scale across the deepest part of the lake. And it worked. After the treatment took hold, the amount of methylmercury in the deep water dropped by roughly 97%. A homegrown idea, developed by researchers working right there on that lake, had accomplished something that dredging alone never could. It did not just remove the old poison, it switched off the factory that kept making new poison. And with that, for the first time in more than a century, the water above was finally ready for life to return. But clearing the poison was only half the work, because a lake can be clean and still be empty. If the plants and creatures that once lived here were ever going to come back, they needed somewhere to live. So alongside the dredging and the chemistry, an enormous effort began along the shoreline, and a great deal of it was done by hand. Crews restored around 90 acres of wetlands along the lake and the streams that feed it. They planted more than 1 million native plants, trees, and shrubs, rebuilding the marshes and grasslands that industry had scraped away. In the shallows, they reintroduced native water plants, the underwater meadows where young fish hide and feed. Before the work, living vegetation covered less than 12% of the lake's shallow areas. Afterward, it covered around 80%. Down on the bottom, workers lowered more than 1,000 habitat structures, piles of rock and boulder and timber, deliberate shelters and hunting grounds for fish. Some of the richest new habitat rose along the creeks that empty into the lake. At places like 9 Mile Creek and Geddes Brook, contaminated ground was dug out. Invasive weeds were torn away, and tens of thousands of native trees and wildflowers were planted in their place, until green, forested wetlands stood on soil that had been poisoned for a century. As the water cleared and the food chain rebuilt itself, the lake slowly reopened to anglers for the first time in a generation. Piece by piece, a dead shoreline was being turned back into a place that could hold life again. And a lot of this was not the work of machines or corporations. It was the work of neighbors. Hundreds of local volunteers, organized into a conservation corps, came out weekend after weekend to plant shrubs, build habitat, and count the wildlife that was starting to return. School teachers, retirees, students, whole families, people who had grown up being warned never to touch this water, were now kneeling in the mud along its shore, planting its future with their own hands. Then came the part that no scientist could schedule and no budget could promise. The ground was ready. Now they had to wait and see what would actually come home. If you are finding this as remarkable as I am, take 1 second to subscribe, because stories like this, about the places we very nearly lost and somehow got back, are exactly what this channel exists to tell. Now let me show you what actually came home. What came back is the very heart of this story. If you had stood on that restored shoreline and simply watched, month after month, you could have kept a running list of the living things returning to a lake that science had once declared nearly dead. You might have started with the great blue heron, standing motionless in the new reeds, hunting the shallows. Then the osprey, wheeling high before folding its wings and dropping to snatch a fish clean out of the water. In winter, the bald eagle, perched out on the ice. The northern harrier, a bird on New York's threatened list, gliding low across the restored grassland. The pied-billed grebe, paddling quietly among the plants. Add the belted kingfisher rattling along the bank, the brilliant white great egret standing in the shallows, and the double-crested cormorant drying its wings on a bare snag. Add the green heron, and small songbirds like the indigo bunting and the common yellowthroat settling into the new brush. Then look at the water itself, because the fish were coming back in force. Largemouth and smallmouth bass, so plentiful that the lake's sport fishing began to earn national attention. Northern pike, walleye, and along the creeks that feed the lake, the mammals returned as well. Mink hunting the water's edge, beaver cutting and building along the banks, muskrat threading through the wetlands, even white-tailed deer moving calmly through ground that a generation earlier had been an industrial wasteland. That is well over a dozen species right there that had vanished from this place and found their way home. And here is what stunned the people who had given their careers to this lake. It was happening faster than anyone had dared to predict. Wildlife did not trickle back over generations. It came flooding back over years. On a single winter morning during one shoreline bird count, volunteers recorded 74 bald eagles sitting on the ice, wheeling over the water, gathered in the largest winter roost of bald eagles anywhere in an urban corner of New York State. On the exact ground where the most polluted lake in America had been poisoning everything above it, the national bird was now gathering by the dozens. By 2017, the last major phase of the habitat work was complete, and the results had shot far past anything written into the original plans. Remember that growing list of returning species? The herons and the eagles and the bass. That list did not stop at a dozen, or at 15, or even at 50. Today, more than 260 species of fish, birds, and other wildlife have been documented in and around Onondaga Lake. The number of fish species alone climbed from around 10 in the darkest years to 65. More than 130 kinds of birds have now been counted along its shores. A lake that scientists had once described as almost lifeless had become one of the richest wildlife areas in the entire region, sitting right beside a major American city. And slowly the people came back too. After generations of being fenced off from their own lake, families could once again fish along its shores, paddle kayaks across the open water, and even swim in certain tested, bacteria-safe zones near the edge. A lake that a whole city had learned to turn its back on was becoming, once more, a place to gather. There is a term biologists use for a creature whose very presence tells you an ecosystem is healthy. They call it an indicator species. When one of the researchers who had studied this lake for years watched a great blue heron stalking fish in the shallows of a cleaned-up creek, he said the bird was telling them something important. It was telling them the lake was coming back to life. You do not get top hunters, the eagles and the ospreys and the herons, unless the entire chain beneath them is working. You do not get them without healthy fish, and you do not get healthy fish without insects and plants and clean water and mud that has finally stopped manufacturing poison. Every eagle standing on that ice was living proof that the whole hidden machine underneath it had been repaired. But this is not a tidy fairy tale, and the people closest to the lake are the first ones to say so. For all the eagles and all the returning fish, Onondaga Lake is still, on paper, a Superfund site. And the deepest disagreement, the one that was there from the very beginning, has never truly gone away. Remember that most of that mercury was never carried off. It was capped, sealed beneath a layer of sand and gravel on the lake bottom, where the science says it is safely contained, but where it still physically remains. The Onondaga Nation has never accepted that as a genuine cleanup, and their argument is simple and hard to dismiss. You have not healed a wound by burying it. The poison that was put into their sacred water is, for the most part, still down there, held in place and watched, but not gone. And there have been real reasons to stay watchful. During the capping work, the barrier was breached more than once before being repaired. A warming climate is driving heavier storms that push against the very systems meant to keep contamination locked away. Federal regulators still return every few years to review the site and confirm the cap is holding. For years, the nation has argued that a true restoration, one that actually removed the poison instead of sealing it, would have cost several times what was spent, and that the story the world now celebrates as a triumph still falls short of what this water is owed. In recent years, though, in a small but real act of repair, roughly 1,000 acres of land in the area were returned to the stewardship of the Onondaga Nation. So which is it, a triumph of science or a poison swept under a very expensive rug? The honest answer is that it is both at once, and that may be the most important lesson of the whole story. One Onondaga scientist and writer has put it beautifully. Real restoration, she argues, is not only about repairing the land, it is about repairing the relationship between people and the land. A give and take, a responsibility that does not end when the machines drive away. Onondaga Lake is cleaner than it has been in more than 100 years. Life has come rushing back to it in ways that genuinely stun the experts, and it still carries its old wound quietly beneath the surface. Every one of those things is true at the same time. Here is why this lake matters far beyond the city it happens to sit beside. For most of the last century, Onondaga was the place people pointed to whenever they wanted to say that some corner of the world was simply beyond saving. The most polluted lake in America, a lost cause. And yet, within a single generation, people pulled the poison from its depths, outsmarted the bacteria that were quietly making it worse, rebuilt its shorelines by hand, and watched more than 260 species come home. The whitefish, the herons, the eagles that had filled this water long before the factories ever arrived, so many of them are here again, along the same shore where families once swam 150 years ago. That does not erase the damage, and it does not settle the debt still owed to the people who held this lake sacred. But it does change something about how we look at every other ruined place on the map. Dead does not always have to mean dead forever. Given enough time, enough science, and enough stubborn human care, even the most poisoned water on an entire continent can begin to breathe again. There is another story cut from exactly the same cloth waiting for you right now on your screen. It is about the last great wilderness left on Earth, a place so vast and so deep that we still barely understand it, and the strange year when humanity simply turned around and stopped exploring it. Go and find out why. And the next time someone tells you that a place is beyond saving, remember the lake on the edge of Syracuse and the eagles standing on the ice.